The meeting was scheduled for 2 p.m. on a Thursday in late September. Performance review and project discussion according to the calendar. Invite from my manager, David Chen, and HR director, Patricia Walsh. I knew immediately it wasn't going to be a routine review. I'd been documenting problems for 8 months. Saving every email, every Slack message, every meeting note. Organizing them by topic and date in folders on my personal drive. Not because I was paranoid, but because I'd seen the pattern emerging and knew I'd eventually need evidence. That Thursday morning, I printed everything. 247 pages of documentation. Emails showing project scope changes that were never properly approved. Messages proving I'd raised concerns about impossible deadlines. Meeting notes. Documenting that I'd requested additional resources and been denied. Communication trails showing exactly who made which decisions and when. I organized the printouts into 7 color-coded folders by topic: scope changes, resource requests, timeline concerns, budget issues, team communication, management decisions, and performance documentation. Then I went to the 2 p.m. meeting carrying all 7 folders in a banker's box. I'm Julia Morrison. I'd been a senior project manager at Catalyst Solutions for 4 years, managing software development projects for healthcare clients. Good performance reviews. Successful project deliveries. Strong relationships with clients and team members. But over the past 8 months, something had shifted. David had assigned me to the Meridian Health implementation, a complex project with an aggressive timeline, understaffed team, and a client who kept changing requirements without adjusting scope or budget. I'd raised concerns from the beginning. Documented every issue. Requested additional resources. Flagged timeline risks. All ignored. Now the Meridian project was behind schedule, over budget, and the client was threatening to pull their contract. And based on the meeting agenda, I was about to be blamed for all of it. David and Patricia were already in the conference room when I arrived. They looked surprised when I walked in carrying the banker's box. "Julia, thanks for coming," David started. "We wanted to discuss the Meridian project status and some concerns about project management." I set the banker's box on the conference table. "Before we start, I want to clarify something. Is this a performance review, a project status meeting, or a disciplinary conversation?" Patricia answered. "We're discussing performance issues related to the Meridian project, so it's disciplinary. We're addressing concerns. Then I'd like to have legal representation present. Under company policy, employees have the right to representation in disciplinary meetings." David and Patricia exchanged glances. "Julia, that's not necessary. This is just a conversation about performance issues, which could lead to discipline. Which means I have the right to representation. I can call our employment attorney now, or we can reschedule." Patricia looked uncomfortable. "Let's reschedule. How's tomorrow at the same time?" "Tomorrow works. I'll have my attorney present." I left the conference room with my banker's box. David followed me into the hallway. "Julia, why are you making this adversarial? We're just trying to address project challenges." "David, the Meridian project has been a disaster from day one because of decisions you made despite my documented objections. If this is a performance conversation, I'm not having it without documentation of what actually happened versus what you're claiming happened." "What documentation?" I gestured to the banker's box. "Every email, every message, every meeting note for the past 8 months. Organized chronologically and by topic. If you're going to blame me for project failures, I'm going to show exactly who made which decisions and when." David's expression changed. "You've been documenting everything? You told me to keep detailed project records." "I did. Very detailed." Back at my desk, I called the employment attorney my sister had recommended when I first started seeing the pattern. His name was Robert Keller, and he specialized in wrongful termination and retaliation cases. "Mr. Keller, this is Julia Morrison. I'm a project manager at Catalyst Solutions. I believe I'm being set up as a scapegoat for project failures caused by management decisions. They just called a performance discussion that I'm pretty sure is the first step toward termination. I have extensive documentation. Can you help?" "What kind of documentation?" 8 months of emails, messages, and meeting notes showing that I raised concerns about project problems, requested resources, flagged risks, and was overruled. Or ignored. Then the project failed, and now they're blaming me. That's excellent documentation. Yes, I can help. Forward me everything you have. I'll review it tonight and meet with you tomorrow before your meeting. What time is the meeting? 2 p.m. Can you be there at 1:30? I'll be there at 1. That evening, I sent Robert everything. All 247 pages, plus the original digital files. Then I spent 3 hours writing a timeline of the Meridian project, noting every major decision point, who made the decision, and what the outcome was. The timeline made the pattern clear. March 2023. David assigned me to Meridian Health implementation. Initial scope: 6-month timeline, team of 5 developers, budget of $450,000. March 15. Client requested additional features. I recommended the scope change process. David said absorb it without formal changes to keep the client happy. April 3. 2 developers reassigned to different projects. I requested replacements. David said, make it work with a reduced team. April 20. Client changed core workflow requirements. I requested scope adjustment and timeline extension. David said, find efficiencies, timeline stays fixed. May 12. I documented that the project was at risk of a 6-week delay without additional resources. David responded, need you to push harder on execution. June 8. Client added 3rd major scope change. I formally requested a scope review meeting with the client to reset the timeline and budget. David denied, don't want to appear. Unable to deliver. July 15th. Project officially behind schedule. I provided an updated timeline showing an 8-week delay. David told me to recover the schedule through better management. August 10. Client, threatening contract cancellation due to delays. David told senior leadership that project management issues were causing problems. August 30. David reassigned 2 more developers, leaving me with 3 people to complete work originally scoped for 5, with 3 major scope additions that were never approved. September 15. Client formally complained to CEO. David told me I was being called to a performance discussion. Every point in the timeline was supported by documentation. Emails. Messages. Meeting notes. Not my opinions, evidence. Friday at 1 p.m., I met Robert Keller in the Sadie Catalyst Solutions parking lot. He was in his 50s, professional but approachable, carrying a leather portfolio that somehow conveyed authority. Julia, I've reviewed your documentation. This is one of the most thoroughly documented cases I've seen. You've methodically recorded every decision point, every concern you raised, every resource request that was denied. This isn't a performance issue on your part. This is management setting you up to take blame for their decisions. That's what I thought. But I wasn't sure if I was just being defensive. You're not. Look at the pattern. They repeatedly increased project scope without adjusting timeline or budget. They removed resources while expanding requirements. They ignored your risk warnings and blamed you when those risks materialized. That's textbook scapegoating. So, what happens in the meeting? Let me do most of the talking. If they make claims about your performance, I'll reference the specific documentation that contradicts those claims. If they try to put failure on you, I'll show exactly who made the decisions that caused the failure. The key is that you've documented everything contemporaneously. These aren't reconstructed memories, they're real-time records of what happened. Will they terminate me? Probably not today. Once they see you have counsel and documentation, they'll likely put the meeting on hold and consult their own lawyers. But Julia, you need to be prepared that this might end in termination anyway. The question is whether you walk away with severance, continued benefits, and no negative reference, or whether you walk away with nothing and potentially sue. At 2 p.m., we walked into the conference room. David and Patricia were there, along with someone I didn't recognize, a man in his 40s wearing an expensive suit. Julia, who's this? David asked, looking at Robert. This is Robert Keller, my attorney. As I mentioned yesterday, I'm exercising my right to have representation at this meeting. The unknown man spoke up. I'm James Bradford, Catalyst's outside counsel. If Ms. Morrison has brought legal representation, I'm here to represent the company's interests. So they brought their lawyer too. This was going to be interesting. Patricia started. Julia, as we mentioned, we're here to discuss concerns about the Meridian Health project. The project is significantly behind schedule and over budget. The client has threatened to cancel the contract, and there are questions about project management decisions that led to these issues. Robert responded before I could. Can you be specific about which project management decisions you're referring to? Decisions about resource allocation, timeline management, scope control. I'd like to address each of those. First, resource allocation. Can you tell me who made the decision to reduce Julia's team from 5 developers to 3 over the course of the project? David shifted uncomfortably. Those decisions were made based on overall company needs, but who made them? Did Julia request reduced resources? No, but, in fact, Robert pulled out a document from his portfolio. Julia sent this email on April 3rd requesting replacement developers after 2 team members were reassigned. The request was denied by David Chen. Then, on August 30th, 2 additional developers were reassigned, and Julia again requested resources. Also denied. He slid copies of both emails across the table. Second, timeline management. The original project timeline was 6 months. How many scope changes were approved during the project? Patricia looked at David. David said, scope changes happen in any project. How many were formally approved with timeline and budget adjustments? Silence. Robert pulled out another document. According to Julia's documentation, the client requested 3 major scope changes. March 15th, April 20th, and June 8th. Each time, Julia recommended formal scope change processes with timeline and budget adjustments. Each time she was told to absorb the changes without formal modifications. Here are the emails. He distributed more documentation. Third, scope control. When the client made the 3rd major scope change on June 8th, Julia requested a scope review meeting with the client to reset expectations and timeline. That request was denied by David Chen, who stated, and I'm quoting from his email, don't want to appear unable to deliver. Is that accurate? David was looking increasingly uncomfortable. We were trying to maintain client satisfaction by committing to deliver work that wasn't in the original scope, with reduced resources on an impossible timeline. And when that inevitable failure occurred, the plan was to blame Julia for performance issues. James Bradford, the company's attorney, intervened. Mr. Keller, these are management decisions made in the context of business needs. These are decisions that violated basic project management principles, ignored documented risk warnings from your project manager, and set up an impossible situation. Die. Now you're holding a disciplinary meeting to blame Julia for the predictable consequences of management's choices. That's not performance management. That's retaliation for Julia raising concerns about problems management created. Before I tell you what happened next, I need you to understand something about this moment. This wasn't about whether I was a good project manager or whether the Meridian project failed. This was about a company trying to protect itself from client complaints by finding someone to blame and using a performance review as the vehicle to do it. If you've ever been blamed for failures caused by decisions you didn't make, if you've ever documented problems only to have management ignore them until disaster strikes, if you've ever been called to a performance discussion that felt meant to raise a called, or like a setup than a review, stay with me. Because what happened when I brought 247 pages of documentation to that meeting changed everything. My name is Julia Morrison, and I've been working at Catalyst Solutions for 4 years as a senior project manager. I wasn't perfect, but I was good at my job. I understood project management principles. I knew how to identify risks, manage scope, communicate with clients, and deliver results. The Meridian Health project had been doomed from the start, and I'd known it. 6-month timeline for complex healthcare software implementation? Aggressive but possible with the right resources. 5-person development team? Adequate if the scope stayed controlled. But then the problem started. The client, Meridian Health, was going through internal reorganization and kept changing their requirements. Normal in healthcare projects, workflows change, stakeholders have different priorities, needs evolve. The correct response is to manage scope changes formally, document the change, assess impact on timeline and budget, get client approval for adjustments, reset expectations. That's project management 101. But David didn't want to do that. Every time I recommended a formal scope change process, he said it would make us look inflexible or unable to deliver. Just absorb it, he'd say. Find efficiency. You can't absorb 3 major scope expansions and continue delivering on the original timeline and budget. That's not inefficiency, that's physics. More work takes more time or more people. I documented every conversation. Every email where I recommended scope changes and was overruled. Every meeting where I flagged timeline risks and was told to push harder on execution. Every resource request that was denied. Not because I was planning to sue or expected to need legal defense, but because I'd worked in project management long enough to know that when projects fail, management looks for scapegoats. And the project manager is always the easiest target. Back in the conference room, James Bradford was trying to reframe the conversation. Mr. Keller, while we appreciate Julia's documentation, the fundamental issue is that the project is failing and the client is threatening to terminate. That's a performance issue that needs to be addressed. The project is failing because management made decisions that made failure inevitable, Robert countered. The client is threatening termination because Catalyst committed to deliverables that weren't achievable, given the resources and timeline you provided. You can't blame Julia for that. We're not blaming. Then what is this meeting about? You called it a performance discussion about concerns related to project management. You're either identifying performance issues, which means you're blaming Julia, or you're not. Which is it? Patricia tried a different approach. Julia, we value your contributions to the company, but we need to understand what went wrong with Meridian and how we can improve going forward. I spoke for the first time since the meeting started. What went wrong is documented in these folders. I pulled the banker's box onto the table and started removing the color-coded folders. Scope changes that weren't properly managed. Resource requests that were denied. Timeline concerns that were dismissed. All documented with dates, email chains, and decision makers. I opened the management decisions folder and pulled out a summary sheet I'd prepared. Here's a timeline of every major decision point on the Meridian project, who made the decision, and what I recommended. In every case where I recommended scope adjustments, additional resources, or timeline changes, I was overruled. In every case, the outcome I predicted came true. David finally spoke up. Julia, you're making this sound like you had no responsibility for project outcomes. You were the project manager. I don't own the results of your decisions. When you removed resources, that was your decision. When you refused to adjust timeline despite scope expansions, that was your decision. When you told me to absorb changes without formal client negotiation, that was your decision. I documented every one of those decisions because I knew this meeting was coming, Robert added, and that documentation is why we're having a very different conversation than you planned. You expected Julia to accept blame for project failures. Instead, you're looking at evidence that those failures were caused by management decisions she explicitly warned against. The meeting went on for another hour. David and Patricia tried different angles, suggesting I should have escalated more, should have managed the team better, should have found ways to deliver despite the constraints. Each time, Robert referenced specific documentation showing I had escalated, had managed the team well given the resources, and had repeatedly explained why delivery wasn't possible under the constraints management imposed. Finally, James Bradford said, I think we need to pause this meeting and regroup. Let me consult with my clients about how to proceed. That's fine, Robert said. But I want to be clear. If Catalyst takes any adverse action against Julia related to the Meridian project, termination, demotion, negative performance review, reduction in responsibilities, we'll consider that retaliation for raising concern. NS about management decisions. Julia has documented every concern, every warning, every risk flag. You ignored all of them. You don't get to blame her when your decisions led to the outcomes she predicted. We left the conference room. Robert walked me to my car. What happens now? I asked. They're going to realize they have a problem. You have documentation showing you did everything right, and management did everything wrong. If they fire you, you can file a wrongful termination suit with evidence that you were terminated for raising concerns about problems you didn't create. That's a strong case. So I won't be fired? They might fire you anyway. But if they do, they'll likely offer significant severance to avoid litigation. The question is what you want. Do you want to stay at a company that tried to scapegoat you? Or would you rather leave with compensation and find somewhere better? I want them to acknowledge what actually happened and stop blaming me for their failures. That might not happen. Companies rarely admit fault. But your documentation creates leverage. Use it. The next week was quiet. No calls from David or Patricia. No follow-up meetings. No termination notice. Then on Friday, I received an email from James Bradford requesting a meeting Monday morning to discuss resolution options regarding the Meridian Project situation. Robert attended the Monday meeting with me. This time, only James was present from Catalyst's side. Ms. Guy Morrison, Mr. Keller, thank you for coming. I've reviewed the documentation you provided, and I've discussed the situation with Catalyst's leadership. We'd like to propose a resolution. I'm listening, Robert said. First, Catalyst acknowledges that resource and scope management decisions contributed to the Meridian Project challenges. We're not placing sole responsibility on Ms. Morrison. That's a start. Second, we'd like to offer Ms. Morrison a choice. She can remain in her current role with assurance that this matter won't affect her performance review or standing. Or if she prefers, we can offer a separation package, 6 months' salary, continued health benefits for that period, and a neutral reference letter. What about the Meridian Project? I asked. Who's taking responsibility for the client relationship? David Chen will be working with the client to reset expectations and timeline based on realistic resource allocation. That's being handled separately from your situation. Robert looked at me. What do you want to do? I thought about it. Stay at a company that had tried to blame me for management failures. Work under David, who'd set me up as a scapegoat. Or take 6 months' salary and find a company that values accurate project management and listens to risk warnings. I'll take the separation package. But I want 2 additions. First, the reference letter needs to explicitly state that I was not terminated for cause and that my performance was satisfactory. Second, I want acknowledgement in writing that the Meridian Project issues were not due to my performance deficiencies. James nodded. I can agree to both. 3 weeks later, I signed the separation agreement. 6 months' salary, $72,000, continued benefits, a neutral reference letter, and a written statement that the separation was mutually agreed upon and not related to performance deficiencies. I also kept all my documentation. 2 months after leaving Catalyst, I got a call from Sandra Park, who'd been a developer on one of my previous projects. Julia, I heard you left Catalyst. Are you working anywhere yet? I'm consulting while I look for the right, full-time opportunity. Why? Because I just got hired as VP of Engineering at Zenith Health Solutions, and I'm building a project management team. I need someone who understands healthcare software, can manage complex implementations, and doesn't BS about project risks. That sounds like you. I'm interested. What's the role? Director of Project Management. You'd be building the PMO, establishing processes, and managing our biggest client implementations. The company actually values project management discipline. We've lost too many projects to poor planning and scope creep. That sounds like the opposite of Catalyst. That's intentional. I worked at Catalyst 5 years ago under similar circumstances, blamed for project failures caused by under-resourcing and scope mismanagement. I swore if I ever ran engineering, I'd do it differently. Proper staffing, formal scope control, realistic timelines. Are you interested? Very. When can we talk? I started at Zenith Health Solutions 3 months after leaving Catalyst. Director of Project Management, $135,000 salary, a $15,000 increase over Catalyst, reporting directly to Sandra. One of my first actions was implementing a scope change management process. No scope changes without documented assessment of timeline, resource, and budget impact. No exceptions. The second action was creating a risk escalation protocol. Project managers document risks, escalate to leadership, and receive documented responses. If leadership chooses to accept risks that PMS flag, that decision is recorded. No more blaming PMS for outcomes they warned against. 6 months into my role at Zenith, Sandra called me into her office. Julia, I wanted to show you something. She pulled up an article on her computer. Catalyst Solutions just lost the Meridian Health contract. Meridian terminated for non-delivery. The article mentions that Catalyst is facing a lawsuit from Meridian for breach of contract. How much? $2.30 million in damages. Meridian is claiming Catalyst misrepresented their ability to deliver and failed to meet contractual obligations. I thought about the banker's box of documentation sitting in my home office. The evidence that I'd warned about exactly this outcome and been overruled. Have you been contacted by anyone from Catalyst or Meridian? Sandra asked. Not yet, but I kept all my documentation. If Meridian's lawyers are building a case that Catalyst should have known they couldn't deliver, my email's showing I told them exactly that would be relevant. 2 weeks later, I got a call from an attorney representing Meridian Health. Ms. 1-2. Morrison, my name is Catherine Reed. I represent Meridian Health in their lawsuit against Catalyst Solutions. We understand you were the project manager on the Meridian implementation. Would you be willing to speak with us about your experience? What specifically? We're gathering evidence that Catalyst knew they couldn't meet the contracted deliverables and timeline. Internal communications from project managers warning about resource constraints, timeline risks, or scope management issues would be relevant to our case. I documented everything extensively. I have emails, meeting notes, and risk assessments showing I repeatedly warned management that the project couldn't be delivered as scoped without additional resources or timeline adjustments. Would you be willing to provide that documentation? I thought about it. Catalyst had tried to blame me for failures caused by their decisions. They'd set me up as a scapegoat, forced me into a separation, and then proceeded to lose the client anyway. Yes, I'll provide the documentation. But I want to be clear, I'm not testifying because I'm angry at Catalyst. I'm providing evidence because it's accurate and relevant to what happened. That's exactly what we need. Truth, not revenge. I sent Catherine Reed copies of my documentation. The emails showing I'd requested resources and been denied. The meeting notes documenting my risk warnings. The scope change requests that were rejected. The timeline assessments that proved I'd accurately predicted the project delays. All the evidence that I'd done my job correctly and management had ignored me. The lawsuit settled 8 months later. I don't know the exact terms, but according to Sandra, who heard through industry contacts, Catalyst paid Meridian a settlement north of $1.50 million to avoid going to trial. My documentation had apparently been central to Meridian's case that Catalyst knew they couldn't deliver and proceeded anyway. A year after leaving Catalyst, I was speaking at a project management conference. My session was titled Documentation as Defense, Protecting Yourself When Projects Go Wrong. A year ago, I told the audience, I was called to a performance review that was actually a setup to blame me for project failures caused by management decisions. They expected me to accept responsibility quietly. What they didn't expect was that I'd spent 8 months documenting everything, every decision, every resource request, every risk warning, every scope change. When I walked into that meeting with 247 pages of printed documentation organized into 7 color-coded folders, their whole strategy collapsed. You can't blame someone for failures when there's documented evidence they warned you repeatedly that those exact failures would occur. Here's what I learned. Management will always try to protect themselves by finding scapegoats. Project managers are easy targets because project failures are visible and complex. But documentation is a defense that management can't easily counter. Not your opinions. Not your memories. Evidence. If you're managing projects in difficult circumstances, understaffed teams, unrealistic timelines, expanding scope, insufficient budgets, document everything. Every concern you raise. Every resource request that's denied. Every risk warning that's ignored. Not because you're planning to sue, but because when projects fail, and they often do in those circumstances, you need evidence that you did your job correctly. After the presentation, a woman of 30s approached me. Ms. Morrison, I'm in exactly the situation you described. I'm managing a project that's clearly under-resourced. Leadership keeps expanding scope without adjusting timeline, and I know this is going to fail. How do I document in a way that actually protects me? First, document contemporaneously. Don't wait until the project is failing to start recording concerns. Do it in real time as issues arise. Second, be specific. Don't just say we need more resources. Say the current team of X people cannot complete Y work by Z date. We need either additional resources or B timeline extension. Third, document responses. When you raise concerns and management dismisses them, note that decision and who made it. Fourth, use email. Verbal conversations can be denied. Written communications create records. Won't that make me look difficult or negative? It might. But would you rather look difficult while the project is ongoing or look incompetent when the project fails and you have no evidence that you warned about problems? I guess when you put it that way, documentation isn't about being adversarial. It's about creating an accurate record of what happened. If your management is making good decisions and listening to concerns, documentation just confirms that everyone's working together. If management is making poor decisions and ignoring warnings, documentation protects you when those decisions lead to failures. 2 years after leaving Catalyst, I ran into David Chen at an industry networking event. He looked uncomfortable when he saw me. Julia, hi, well. How now? Are you? I'm doing well. Director of Project Management at Zenith Health Solutions, building their PMO and managing major implementations. I heard you landed on your feet. That's good. How's Catalyst? We've had some challenges. The Meridian situation was difficult, and we lost a few other clients in the aftermath. I'm sorry to hear that. Julia, I wanted to say, the way we handled the Meridian situation with you wasn't fair. We were under pressure from the client and from senior leadership, and we made you the scapegoat. That was wrong. Yes, it was. If it helps, I learned from it. I don't ignore risk warnings anymore. And I don't expect project managers to deliver miracles when they don't have adequate resources. That's good. But you shouldn't have needed to learn that lesson at my expense. I know. I'm sorry. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, I want you to understand something. This isn't about being vindictive or litigious. It's about protecting yourself in work environments where management might try to blame you for their failures. When Catalyst tried to scapegoat me for the Meridian project, they expected I'd have no defense beyond my word against theirs. What they got instead was 247 pages of documented evidence showing exactly who made which decisions and what the outcomes were. That documentation didn't just protect me from unfair termination. It gave me leverage to negotiate a favorable separation, provided evidence for Meridian's lawsuit against Catalyst, and ultimately validated that I'd been doing my job correctly all along. If you're working in project management, if you're raising concerns that get ignored, if you're seeing decisions that you know will lead to failure, document everything. Not secretly or vindictively. Just accurately and comprehensively. Because when things fall apart, and they often do when management ignores reality, documentation is the difference between being blamed and being vindicated. If this resonates with you, hit that like button and subscribe. Share your experiences in the comments about times documentation saved you or times you wished you documented more. Those stories help others understand why records matter. Remember, they underestimated me because I stayed quiet while they made bad decisions. When they tried to lie about what happened, I brought every documented truth to the table. Their faces dropped, and their strategy collapsed.